Project Torrim is an Iron Age fantasy tower defense game that I worked on between April 2020 and April 2021. The game lets you build up a huge army to fend off hordes of evil creatures and defeat mythical bosses. With it taking a year to develop, it made a huge impact on my life. It grew my game development skills, and the accompanying Devlog series brought me back to YouTube. Now, it's been a few months since the game's release, and I want to take a look back at the whole project. I want to discuss the game's release, mention the things I didn't get to in the devlogs, and I want to talk about the lessons I learned so I don't stumble into the same issues on my next one. The idea to create a tower defense game was one I had always discussed with my flatmate. As software engineers and gamers, we would often pick up small game development projects every now and then, but unfortunately neither of us ever completed a game. This got to me because I want to create games, so in late 2019 I managed to get myself into gear and finish a Halloween themed Flappy Bird clone. This was a huge turning point for me. Having a game for people to play felt fantastic and gave me the momentum to dive into game development. After making a few more games, I felt that my engine was ready for the tower defense game I had discussed with my flatmate all those years ago. However, starting the project turned out to be harder than I had anticipated. The first thing I ran into when making Project Torrim was the idea for the game was very vague. When you're developing a game, you need a solid idea to build upon. My experience playing tower defense games was very limited, and much of the game's design was drawn from what I could remember playing Bloons Tower Defense about 8 years ago. Looking back to those early days, I wish I'd spent time playing other tower defense games to get a better feeling for what makes them good. It's impossible to know how that would have affected the game, but making sure you've done your research is key to starting a game. Another thing I struggled with at the start of development was the setting and art direction. I honestly had no idea what to do, with the original concept coming from a random game name generator. The names generated were Poisonous Wasteland, which I used for the setting, and the Unholy Yak Siege, which inspired the towers and enemies. Whilst this approach was great for concentrating on the nuts and bolts of the game mechanics, it left the visuals in a right state. Eventually I rethemed the game to an Iron Age fantasy setting, which allowed me to create more towers, a better variety of enemies and cool bosses. But despite those changes, I felt that the damage was already done, and without a complete restart, then it just couldn't be fixed. Now, when I look back, I think it would have been better if I had spent some time to flesh out the look of the game, creating some concepts to get a better feeling for the setting and the art direction before jumping into the code. In many ways, I see these two issues as the root causes for every other problem I ran into during development. For example, the game's performance was on the edge for quite some time, and I had to scramble to improve it in the last few weeks of development. If I had known how many enemies and towers the game would need to work, then I could have made the appropriate performance changes before it became an issue. Another example is game feel. This is something I've seen a lot of game devs talk about, and whilst I think they overcompensate to make their games super juicy, Project Torrim had nearly no juice. Now by that I don't mean to say the game's boring, but it could have had an extra layer of interactivity to really suck in the player. This was something I had actually thought about a lot during development, however I avoided it to not balloon the game's development time. That brings me nicely onto something I feel I did quite well during the game's development, keeping organised with my Trello board and not letting small things overwhelm the project. I tried to keep everything in bite-sized tasks, so each week I could achieve a goal, and whether anything new came up such as the retheme or performance issues, I would estimate how long it would take, meaning I always had a rough idea of when the game could be ready. This went through various stages. When I first started, I'd hoped the project would take a few months and would be ready in September. By the time it actually got to September, the game just didn't feel right. That's when I decided to work on it a little longer, to retheme it and make it feel better to play. At that point I reviewed everything and hoped to get the game ready by the end of 2020, which it almost was. However, that's when I noticed the game's performance issues. I knew it had to be fixed, so again I pushed the release back to give myself time to fix it. Eventually I managed to get the game into a state I was happy with. That coincided with the anniversary of the first devlog, which I think was quite a poetic send-off for the game. Now of course, getting the game out to release doesn't mean it was everything I had hoped for. Working on a game for such a long time and getting feedback through devlogs gives you a plethora of new ideas. To this day my Trello board still has loads of tasks that I'll never get to. This seems sad, but really it's not. Cutting these features meant I could actually release the game. If I'd been a perfectionist and worked on everything that came up during development, I would still be working a year from now, and my list of tasks will continue to grow. Therefore, I want to emphasise that cutting features is a key skill for developers that actually want to release games. Refusing to cut ideas will lead you to a never-ending development. You'll never be happy with your game, and no one will ever play it. So what's the point of even developing it? Keep your eyes on the prize and release your game. How have I managed to get this far without discussing devlogs? Devlogs were a huge part of the Project Torrim journey. I had seen a few indie devlogs when I began development, and I realised if I started my own series, then the game might get into more hands than just my friends and family. The early devlogs were pretty straightforward, inspired by DevDuck, BWDev and Thin Matrix. I just showed progress on the game through daily updates. Eventually I got into watching a lot of devlogs, and I realised I disliked the devlogs I was making. Giving updates for the short period of time I worked each day wasn't interesting, and limited the amount of detail I could go into. Changing this to a weekly overview with working segments and technical discussions fit much better. I found that my view count then started to go from the 20s to the 50s, and eventually by the end of the series each video will get at least 100 views. Now you may think, 100 views, that's nothing, and in many ways you're right. The views my channel has received in the last year and a half are less than 2% of my total views. However, I've never seen so much engagement with my channel. 7 out of 10 of my most commented videos are from game dev, and 8 out of 10 of my most liked videos are from game dev. I really think YouTube's game development community is great, and if you put in the time you will eventually grow. If you're a YouTuber, then don't let the views get you down. Look at how far you've come and enjoy the journey. As I look back at the devlogs, I realised that weekly updates were pretty intense, and I think I only managed to keep up the pace because of COVID lockdown. Last summer when the original lockdown in England was eased, there were some devlogs that almost didn't make it. Thinking of my timetable back then, it was pretty packed. Fitting game development, work and devlogs together was quite the task. In particular, I felt that the devlogs suffered in quality, as I had less than a weekend to create each one. That being said, if I could go back, I wouldn't change a thing. I really enjoyed releasing weekly devlogs, as it kept me very close to the community. I can't continue posting weekly videos, however, I still have plans for devlogs. More about that at the end of this video. And finally, that brings us to the game's release. I'm sure everybody has the same two questions in their head. How many people played, and did it make any money? Let's start with how many people played. As mentioned earlier, I used to share my games with friends and family. I'd be lucky if the amount of plays went above 10. The game currently sits on 72 downloads, which I am thrilled with. The devlogs really brought in more players than I expected. I really didn't think there'd be more than 25 downloads. Another thing I never thought would happen is making money from the game. I put the game up completely free with an optional donation, and a few people bought it. I'm super happy that you think it was worth buying, and I really hope you enjoyed it. All in all, I made about $17.90, which in real money comes out about £12.90 minus a bit for each, so I'm no millionaire, but it can go towards a game, which I can use to research for my next project. Now, as you might expect, having people play your game means that you get feedback, and boy, I got a lot of feedback. Thanks to everybody that commented, rated, or even streamed the game. I added every little bit of feedback to Trello, so if I ever come back to it, it'll be the first thing I address. The vast majority of the feedback is about the usability of the game. In general, the game is playable, but some things could have been implemented or communicated to the player in a better way. For example, quite a few people didn't know how to change the direction of ballista towers, and almost nobody knows about the damage type system. Looking back now, I wish I had expanded the instruction screen to cover everything the player would need. Most people worked it out in the end, however it was an unnecessary obstacle that weakened the game experience. That being said, I thoroughly enjoyed watching people play the game. Many people thought it was going to be relaxing, but when a new enemy spawned or a boss appeared, they were scrambling to get their army in order. The game turned into a gauntlet. Everybody that beat it got a real sense of accomplishment, which to me is fantastic because I never expected such a reaction. Especially this one from the Shelf Man.
Oh my god. Am I gonna be able to do this? If I make it, I'm gonna be super surprised. Oh my god. Is it possible? Mom, I did it! Mom, Dad, I did it! Yow! Yow! I beat it! I beat it! Yo! Scaffold, man. Scaffolds. I'ma just tell you this. That was awesome. The amount of stress it gave me with the feeling of satisfaction when you beat it just in time, it's great. Holy crap.
Unfortunately, it wasn't always the same story. Tahid ran into a bug which told him he'd lost even when he won.
But obviously I don't know if... What? How did I lose? What happened there? Waves remaining 7. Alright, let's load it up again. Wait, where's my stuff go? Did I win or did I lose? Do I have to start the game again?
Funnily enough, this bug was the same that the Shelfman ran into for Super Word Chain. Basically what happens is the end screen caches itself, so earlier on in the game Tahid died and reloaded his save. When he beat the game, the cached screen was loaded and shown rather than the new win screen. Whilst this is an incredibly annoying bug, it's not hugely game breaking. And luckily Tahid is determined, and a few days later he sent me his victory screen. Now that was probably the biggest bug in the game. And there are a few other bugs, nothing major, however there were 2 that really stood out to me. First, the tower firing bug. When you place down towers you may find that they're firing at enemies that aren't in their range. Luckily I had some code to reset the towers that got into this state, but it's really annoying to show someone the game and have that bug happen. The second issue is with the game's sound. It's incredibly loud, and as you progress through the game it gets louder. This is simply because the same sounds are being played so much that it becomes super loud. I'm glad I added volume controls, but even still, players will find themselves constantly cranking the volume down until they couldn't bear it anymore. Well, I think that covers everything I want to say about Project Torrim. I thoroughly enjoyed working on it, making the devlogs and seeing everyone's reaction to the game. Looking forward, I'm taking the lessons I learned from Project Torrim into a brand new museum management game. I've already done some research on management games when I streamed in February and March, and I started to get an idea for the game's art direction when I participated in Pixel Mania. I plan on making regular devlogs for the new game, at least once a month. But if you can't wait for a new devlog, you can now follow me on Twitter. Yes, that's right, I finally cracked and am now on Twitter, tweeting my progress as I go. Thank you to everybody that supported Project Torrim throughout its development and release. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you stick around for my next game. I'll see you in the first devlog.